The blizzard hit the Montana territory without warning, turning the world into a wall of white. Inside his log cabin, Daniel Thornton sat by the fire, mending a bridle by lamplight. The wind howled like wolves outside, rattling the shutters. He'd lived alone in these mountains for 8 years now, and the sound didn't bother him anymore. Silence and solitude had become his companions after the war took everything else. Then came the knocking dot soft at first, almost lost in the storm. Then harder, more desperate. Daniel set down his work and moved to the door, hand instinctively touching the rifle by the frame. You didn't get visitors up here, especially not in weather like this. He pulled the door open, hand of wind threw snow into his face. Through the swirling white, he saw her. A young woman sat collapsed on his doorstep. Her white dress torn and soaked through, long dark hair plastered to her face. She was barefoot in the snow, shivering so hard her whole body shook. But it was what she held that made Daniel's breath catch. A tiny baby, maybe 2 months old, wrapped in a thin gray blanket. The infant wasn't crying. That scared him more than if it had been. The woman looked up at him with dark eyes full of fear and exhaustion. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as the snow around her. She tried to speak, but only a whisper came out, words he couldn't hear over the wind. Daniel didn't ask questions. "Get in," he said, reaching down to help her up. She couldn't stand on her own. He lifted her carefully, one arm around her waist, and pulled her inside. She clutched that baby to her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Daniel kicked the door shut against the storm and guided her to the chair closest to the fire. "Don't move," he said, already pulling blankets from his bed. He wrapped them around her shoulders, then gently took the baby from her trembling arms. The child was cold, too cold, but breathing. Daniel tucked more blankets around the tiny body and laid the infant carefully in the wooden cradle he'd built years ago for a future that never came. The woman watched him with those haunted eyes, tears mixing with melted snow on her cheeks. She was native, he realized now, seeing the delicate bone structure of her face, though her dress suggested she'd been living among settlers. Young, maybe 20, with a kind of beauty that came from strength as much as features. Daniel heated water and brought her a cup, wrapping her frozen fingers around it. "Drink slow," he told her. "You're half froze." She sipped, her hands shaking so badly the water nearly spilled. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought we would die out there." "You nearly did." Kanya moved to check on the baby, relieved to see color returning to the small face. "What's your name?" "Margaret," she said quietly. "Margaret Whitehorse. The baby is Anna." Daniel Thornton. He stoked the fire higher, then went to a small kitchen area. "When did you last eat?" Her silence was answer enough. He heated stew left from his own supper and brought her a bowl. She ate like someone who'd forgotten what food tasted like, every bite deliberate and grateful. Daniel sat across from her, waiting until she'd finished before asking the question hanging in the cold air between them. "What are you running from?" Margaret's hands tightened on the empty bowl. For a long moment, she just stared into the fire. Then, slowly, the story came. She'd been married to a settler named Thomas Reed, a man who'd seemed kind when he courted her, but turned cruel after the wedding. When Anna was born, he'd grown worse. Angry that the baby looked too much like her mother. Angry that his friends mocked him for having a native wife. 3 days ago, drunk and raging, he'd threatened to take Anna away. Said he'd give her to a mission school back east where they'd raise her proper. Margaret had waited until he passed out, then ran. She'd been walking for 2 days with almost nothing, trying to reach her mother's people in the next valley. Then the storm hit, and she'd gotten lost. She'd seen Daniel's lamplight through the trees and stumbled toward it like a drowning person reaching for shore. "He'll come looking," she finished, her voice barely audible. "When the storm clears, Thomas will come." Daniel stood and checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. "Let him come," he said simply. Over the next 3 days, while the blizzard raged outside, Daniel's cabin became something it hadn't been in years a home. Margaret recovered her strength, and Anna thrived in the warmth. Daniel taught Margaret how to bank the fire to last through the night, showed her where he kept supplies. She mended his shirts with careful stitches and cooked stew that tasted better than anything he'd made himself. But it was the quiet moments that changed something in him. Watching Margaret rock Anna by the firelight, singing soft songs in her mother's language, the sound of another person breathing in the darkness, the way the baby's tiny hand would curl around his rough finger when he checked on her at night. On the 4th morning, the storm finally broke. Daniel stood at the window, watching sunlight turn the snow to diamonds, and knew what was coming. Sure enough, by midday, he heard horses. Through the window, he saw 3 men riding up, led by a big man with a red face and mean eyes. Thomas Reed. Daniel stepped outside, rifle in hand. Margaret stayed inside with Anna, but he could feel her watching through the window. Far enough. Daniel called out when the men were still 20 yards away. Thomas pulled up his horse, his face twisted with anger. "You've got my wife in there, Thornton, and my kid. Hand them over." "Don't see it that way," Daniel replied calmly. "I see a woman and child who nearly froze to death running from you. That tells me all I need to know about what kind of husband and father you are." "She's my property," Thomas snarled. The law's 3 days' ride from here," Daniel interrupted. "And the way I see it, a man who'd send a woman and baby out into a blizzard ain't got any claim worth respecting. You best turn around and leave while you still can." Thomas's hand moved toward his gun. "I ain't leaving without Daniel's rifle," came up fast, aimed dead center at Thomas's chest. His voice went cold as the snow around him. "Yes, you are." The 2 men with Thomas exchanged glances, clearly not interested in dying over another man's bad marriage. Thomas sat there, rage and calculation warring on his face. Finally, he spat in the snow. "This ain't over," he growled. "It is," Daniel said. "You go back and tell folks your wife died in the storm, if that saves your pride. But you come back here, and I promise you won't leave." Thomas jerked his horse around and rode off, his companions following. Daniel didn't lower his rifle until they disappeared into the trees. When he turned back to the cabin, Margaret stood in the doorway, Anna in her arms. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. "Why?" she asked simply. "You don't know us. Why would you risk this for us?" Daniel looked at her, at the baby, at the home that had felt empty for so long. "Because some things are worth the risk," he said, "and because I reckon I've been alone long enough." Margaret's smile widened. "So have we." That spring, when the snow melted and wildflowers covered the mountain meadows, folks in the valley below heard that the hermit rancher Daniel Thornton had taken a wife. Some whispered about it, but most figured a man's business was his own, especially in the territories where starting over was what brought most people in the first place. Up in his cabin by the pine woods, Daniel didn't care much what people thought. He was too busy teaching Anna to walk, helping Margaret plant a garden, and learning that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, the ones that find us when we've stopped looking. The storm had brought them together. Love made them stay. Sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as desperate knocks on cold winter nights. Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves are the very things keeping out what we need most. And sometimes just opening the door is the bravest thing we can do. If this story warmed your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment telling us about a time someone opened their door for you, or when you opened yours for someone else. These stories of kindness matter now more than ever.